Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is, actually, I'll say my real name, Mauricio Trujillo, and also known as Bunny or Conejo Capital on Twitter. We're building a multi-chain search engine, a block explorer. It's called Adora. And also, thank you, everyone, for being here right now. Yeah, name of the talk, what we search for. Search engines in an era of modular existence. So first of all, what does this mean? How can Adora actually help with any of this? What does it, there you go. How can we actually use the search engine approach to approach, let's say, some stuff that have been talked about already, modular applications, being able to actually interact with specific chains, and also how do people actually, even to begin with, how do we approach infrastructure today? What are the different heuristics that we interact with? Some of the ones that we were already talked about. Application specific, rollups, so on and so forth, intent aggregators, multi-ecosystem type of application. Then search data, how do people actually relate to all of these goods and services day to day? How people start searching, let's say, through brands instead of searching for very clearly defined queries to engage with a good and service. Then externally branded monolithic chains as opposed to internally branded modular apps that may leverage infrastructure that is embedded exclusively, that is very opinionated as to what they may enable. And as well as, hey, how do we ultimately end up engaging with all of this? So first of all, I see a little story. So Jazz and Jacob, also from the Celestia team, approached me. They're like, hey, Bunny, can you actually speak at the at Modular Summit? And I'm like, yeah, I'm more than happy to. Always ready to speak whenever someone else needs to. So one of the first things that I go is like, okay, I have no idea what people are going to be talking about Modular Summit or then modularity in the overarching sense of the word. So what do? I start searching. How do people actually start searching in their day-to-day lives? People start searching on their day-to-day lives in, let's say, at least within crypto. We've somehow stumbled upon the semblance of having intents. Intents meaning whatever your definition of it may be, as it being bounced on the end state of an action on the state change, constraints on the state change, or also, as Vlad said, something along the lines of they are a glimpse into your deepest desire, the deepest desires of someone's brain. No matter your definition of intents, they are something that we can all clearly agree expresses something as simple as I want to do X, and that's it. So how are intents able to leverage stuff like DeFi, gaming, NFTs, and identity-specific applications? They're able to leverage all of these because they don't necessarily make any concrete differentiator between them. They may not necessarily measure different security assumptions. All they really care about, and that is the nature of intents, is that your end interaction gets fulfilled, and that's it. What type of world do we build with all of this type of infrastructure? The type of world that we build is one in which composability is pretty much unquestionable, and we end up in a world in which we have an any-to-any type of relationship between goods and services, in which no matter what resources you have currently available, there will always be infrastructure that allows you to partake on any good and service you may wish so. How are we actually able to enable this? We have some multi-ecosystem infrastructure. This is honestly one of my preferred stacks. We have some of the people in the room from those logos there. You may recognize a couple of people from Caldera, Modular Cloud, Squid, Skip, routing mechanisms, roll-up as a service, indexing mechanisms. They are all and of course, intents. They're all very much needed to be able to enable this type of workflow that people are very used to in the regular world. That regular world meaning outside of crypto. But is that how people really relate to? Sorry, is there a button to go back? This one? Sorry, thank you. How do people actually relate to all of these goods and services within crypto, and how do people relate to all of these outside of it? It's very clear. There's a point in which every single crypto app starts pretty much looking like each other. We call this effect in recognizing patterns where there may not be any pareidolia. There's a pareidolia of dApps in which people start seeing stuff like NFT marketplaces on Uniswap. People start seeing swapping mechanisms within NFT marketplaces. People start seeing options where there may not necessarily be a need or a desire for someone to actually start leveraging options. So what we find is that all of these goods and services eventually become commoditized. Something very fascinating, though, is that while the goods and services may be commoditized, the providers are non-fungible. Every other provider will be selling you the exact same thing, but in a much different type of delivery packaging that some people may be used to. And that's actually good. That's very good, actually. So how do people outside of crypto relate to searching intents and fulfilling of any desires they may have? Where can we actually look at something like this? We can look at search data, which is honestly one of the most valuable data in the world, in my opinion. People don't necessarily look for goods and services in a very clearly defined query. They actually, if you look at the top 100 searches on Google or even across search engines, especially if you start very heavily localizing, people relate to goods and services through brands. They don't necessarily, it is very rare that actually something as concrete that is not brand heavy makes it to the top 100 searches. It's usually just related to like World Cup events, and even then you could argue that, okay, there are events, there are sports. So we have brands as a proxy for actions. We have Antimaria, in which the verification of nouns, not the announced NFT, of course, but where we get to is that we have these two first and second degrees of Antimaria. Where a lot of infrastructure is currently laying on is that we have ways in which you have protocols like, not necessarily protocol, action at this point, emailing. People feel very comfortable saying, hey, email me, just send me a message. They don't necessarily specify which provider they may be engaging with, and that's completely fine. Another way of using, is not exactly the protocol, but something akin to being able to emit a message. Twitter, people feel very comfortable using the anti-numeric word tweeted. This very easily allows us to convey, hey, I want you to express an opinion, I want you to tell that opinion to the world. People feel very easy doing that. So if this is how people search, okay, we understand that brands are very important. We understand that maybe it's actually good to have branding around certain applications, maybe certain chains, but is it enough? There's this concept of branding, externally branding your monolithic chain. In this sense, meaning that if you have an, let's say, a forked EVM chain is just done, it's the exact same thing as an EVM, but you just so happen to have an NFT marketplace in that chain, and that's all that you really do there. It's not necessarily optimized for NFTs. It's just a chain that has an NFT smart contract, and that's completely fine. That's pretty good for most people. Where we very much like to push for, though, is that we want people to be incredibly opinionated about the infrastructure that they leverage for their specific use case. In this sense, what we're actually pushing for is app chains. We believe that very entire approach will be to create brands around a generalizable chains applications, whereas what we should be aiming for, and forgive me, there's a typo there, is to create infrastructure around such chain-specific applications. In this sense, if your application, let's say very, very high-frequency trading specific application should have the shortest finality time and shouldn't be contested, maybe something like IBC should be considered. Maybe something that, I don't know, the YDX is a very clear example of that. Maybe there's applications in which you should rely more on social consensus as opposed to some very, very clearly defined cryptographic security mechanisms. Who knows? We can play around with this. The ethos of modularism is very much of build anything, and we strongly believe that if we should build anything, why shouldn't we actually build this in a way that we can actually start iterating on goods and services on monolithic ecosystems, which is precisely what we've seen, and then actually go into production and optimize for service providers, for different service providers' economic incentives on something like a modular stack. In this sense, one of these examples that is actually a paper that should be getting published either today or tomorrow by Tarun Chitra is in how sequencing and you can model pretty much every single DeFi app as a sequencing of liquidations. In that sense, if you start considering that sequence, then ordering becomes wholly incredibly important, and you can start arguing for the certain sequencing of of certain chains should be the most theoretically optimal for this specific DeFi application. That is a fascinating concept. I think it's very interesting to say every single application that is deployed on this chain will not have a competitive edge against this one DeFi application. That's fascinating. So now every single app is a chain. how do we actually go about searching every single one of these applications? How do we actually go about engaging with every single one of these providers once every single one of these providers starts looking the same, or hopefully they don't, and once every single one of these providers is able to leverage their specific infrastructure that makes their ecosystems blossom as much as almost theoretically no one else can. What we do at Adora is we like to take the approach of a generalized search engines. We very much believe that power users will end up engaging with topic-specific aggregators. We're all in Paris right now. I don't know how many people in the room are based out of Paris or even France or Europe in general, but I will bet that most of you ended up using at some point either something like an airline aggregator. Maybe at first we started engaging when we first got into the industry. We're like, oh, I'm going to my first conference. I want to see what I can use for traveling. If we were very experienced travelers before, we probably use something like Google. Then in the end, we of course narrow down into, okay, I want to use my Expedia. I don't know. There's plenty. I just use Expedia because it's very convenient. But what we see for an appropriate ecosystem that lends itself to being mass adopted is that users will engage with the most generalizable, meaning the one that is able to capture the most providers, has the most coverage, friendly, quite simply, just being able to understand it from the get-go. I thought it was insane the first time I got into a plane. I was like, wow, how do people actually get this? And my parents told me, oh, you just go on the internet, and I was blown away by that. And provider-acknowledged search engines. If we believe that every single one of these brands is actually incredibly meaningful to the experience of a user actually engaging with these goods and services, search engines should be incredibly intentional as to what brands they're leveraging in order to provide all these services. What we do at Adora is, we have a couple examples of it actually. What we do at Adora is we try to be incredibly intentional as to, hey, these are the specific tokens that you're swapping. These, if we click on, let's say, the crypto.com to the transaction there, you're swapping USDC, we tell you that this USDC is being provided by Circle. If you click on every single one of the smart contracts, we try to make it abundantly clear what types of organizations these smart contracts are associated to. That way, hopefully giving people their assurance of, hey, you don't necessarily even have to trust Dora, right? Whereas search engines, there's a very funny thought experiment that maybe the chain is dead and the block explorers have just been producing information for you. That could be true. Block explorers could be lying to you. But still, we don't want people to trust us. What we want is people to trust brands. That is who they seem to trust right now. That is who people, I mean, Celestia is also a brand. We seem to trust them to figure out modularism. They're doing an amazing job at it. So therefore, why should we actually change the way people just behave and think right now? And thank you so much. Love you all. Thank you for coming here. Thanks. If anyone has any questions as well, more than happy to. Yeah. If anyone has specific questions as to how our stack works as well, because it is infrastructure day as well, more than happy to dive a little bit more into that.
Yeah, feel free.
Oh. Yeah, we actually, I think block explorers are actually really interesting on that, because we haven't found a world in which we needed to rely that heavily into our own proprietary technology up until recently. There was very much a rundown to the bottom on stuff like indexing within EVM chains. That was something that we found as, there were a plenty of providers that ended up showing up. There's been a run to the bottom as to how to actually go about indexing it. I think we've done a fairly wonderful job at it, not only us, but also some of our close partners, Goldsky Simple Hash. I think it is an interesting question as to see what are we going to see a run to the bottom of indexing approaches on a modular ecosystem. I think that is all necessarily quintessential to be able to even begin to fathom whether or not we're going to be able to let these ecosystems blossom. Yeah, I think there's a couple really good teams doing amazing work at that. I think Modular Cloud is one of those teams. So let's see how we can make these ecosystems be better than everyone else.